Welcome to the final session of our Building Bridges seminar. I'm delighted to see so many faces from the first sessions who've thought it worthwhile to come again and join us for what I hope will be, again, an interactive session of discussion about the themes of our seminar. As you see, we have a panel here for discussion, and I'll introduce the members of the panel in a moment, but first let me say how we're going to manage our time together. I'd like to say a few words of introduction to some of the themes that have been coming up in the last couple of days, and then I'm going to invite members of the panel, each of them to say a word about their first impressions of the Building Bridges seminar and particular things that have struck them. They're going to have 3 or 4 minutes each to say that. Then I hope we will talk among ourselves for a little and then open up to our audience for further discussion. We have, I think, about an hour and a half for this, so I hope people won't feel too pressured, and I hope that we'll be able to open up with this wider public some of the very searching and very interesting themes that have emerged so far. But first, let me introduce the panel. On my right, Dr. Abdul Karim Saroush, who is known to a good many as one of, I hope I won't embarrass him by saying this, one of the leading Muslim intellectuals of the globe at the moment, and we're particularly honored and delighted that he's been able to participate in this session with us. Dr. Harriet Harris teaches theology at Wadham College in Oxford and is an ordained priest of the Church of England. Dr. Chana Duggley teaches at Holy Cross College and has been a very valued participant in this seminar, bringing to it a keen knowledge of both philosophical and historical dimensions of the Islamic traditions that we've been looking at. And Professor Gavin da Costa teaches theology at Bristol University in the United Kingdom and is the author of several books of theology, including a couple of very valuable book-length essays on the theology of interfaith encounter. And I'm Rowan Williams, and I'm Archbishop of Canterbury, and I convene these Building Bridges seminars to my great delight every year. The idea for this seminar emerged originally last year when our group was looking at issues around faith and the scientific worldview. And it seemed to some of us that many of the issues that were arising in that context pushed us towards some rather deeper and wider questions about modernity, this very elusive and difficult word which we throw around quite a lot in philosophical and theological discussion. So this year's seminar has been an attempt to broaden out a little from the issues we looked at last year and to think through tradition and modernity. Both Islam and Christianity, in their different ways, have concepts of tradition, and in the last couple of days we've found out just how different some of those ways are. But both of us, as religious confessions, hold that there is a set of practices, a style of wisdom in life and in prayer, transmitted by teaching from generation to generation, with bound up in that certain assumptions about authority, about being able to receive with confidence and gratitude something that is given to you. Modernity, on the other hand, is often seen as not even a system, but a general style of human living and understanding, which lays primary emphasis on the individual's choices, and the individual's liberty to map out their journey through life. Modernity, in the most general sense, it seems, encourages us to be rather suspicious of what is given to us or offered to us, especially if it comes with authority attached to it. So some of these very broad brush ideas were around the beginning of our discussions. Where have we got to? We don't, at these seminars, issue an agreed statement. And that, I have to say, takes a great deal of pressure off the participants. We don't have to spend the last day and a half arguing over where the paragraph breaks come in a communique or anything like that. We simply, I was going to say we talk until we drop. It's almost true this time. It's been a very strenuous program. But we discuss, we try to open those discussions and simply go away with a sense, I hope, of enriched understanding. But I want to pick up very briefly in these opening remarks a few themes that have kept coming back. First of all, modernity. It's really a very modern thing that people assume that being modern is something distinctive. I don't imagine that in the 13th century, being modern was a meaningful concept at all, either in the Christian or in the Muslim world. But being modern has, for at least 150, perhaps 200 years, had an evaluative content in a lot of Western civilization. Being pre-modern or anti-modern has been to mark yourself out as reactionary, as thoughtless, sometimes as non-emancipated. Modernity, as it's often used, in other words, has an evaluative dimension, and that in itself, as I've said, is a modern thing. At the same time, modernity is not a simple concept at all, as someone pointed out earlier in our discussion today. There is a modernity which simply means knowing your way around the world of technology, the resources that are, as a matter of fact, available in the world of today. And the fact that we are here, many of us, because we've flown in on aeroplanes, that some of our discussions have been streamed electronically, and so forth, that's modernity. We know how to use it, or at least we know people who know how to use it more significantly. And that's rather different from modernity as an evaluative thing, modernity as a worldview. So we gave ourselves a few cautions in throwing the word around too loosely. But when we were pressed to think through some of the evaluative dimension of modernity, one theme which came up a number of times, yesterday and today, was the way in which modernity, in this evaluative sense, had made a difference not only to how we understood ourselves as human beings, but how we understood our place in the whole natural order. It's typical of a certain kind of modern culture, self-consciously modern culture, that it takes a highly instrumental view of the environment, including sometimes the human environment. It privileges, it seems, choice over wisdom or even reasoning. And it can lead us to a very strange view of the isolation of human agents and human speakers from the natural world they're in, and can lead us to take for granted that the only relationship that matters on the part of the things around us and the people around us is their relationship with me, the choosing, thinking, planning, controlling me. Now, it's fundamental to a religious vision of the world, whether Christian or Muslim, that before I am on the scene, other people and other things already have a relationship to the sacred, to God, to the source of all meaning and all reality. So that when I approach the world around, or when I approach another person, I approach it with a sense that there is a dimension of it that's just not accessible to my control. It exists already in relation to another level of reality. That's part of what it means, we were reminded, to believe that the world is created. There is a relationship of reality to the depth and source of life, quite independent of what I make of it and how I use it. And more than once in our discussion, the theme came through. Modernity, as a worldview, as a general approach, has tended to weaken that sense of, and I think the phrase was, the face of reality turned towards God. And that means that characteristic of modernity as a worldview is an idea that all realities are, so to speak, exhausted in their lateral relations to one another. So when I know how to use this or that, I know all there is to know. When I know how to negotiate with and sometimes, frankly, to use another person, I know all there is to know. The sense of a dimension that lures me more deeply disappears. So that was one theme that in various ways kept coming back. That the religious perspective on reality, Muslim, Christian, and indeed in traditions quite other than those two, was very much at odds with that instrumental or exploitative vision of our environment. Very naturally, of course, in that connection, we found ourselves talking about freedom. Freedom, the great value of modernity as a worldview, but frequently freedom in the modern context regarded simply as the fact that nobody tells me what to do, that I have a choice of objects and no constraint on what I choose. In our traditions, freedom, of course, means something rather different, and it's sometimes been characterized as a freedom that is my liberty to exercise what I truly am as a human being, my liberty to discover and to live out the destiny that is there in virtue of my being created by God and loved by God and engaged with by God. So from the very beginning of the seminar, and some of you will remember David Hart's very powerful presentation on Tuesday, from the beginning of the seminar, divergent views of freedom have been around in our discussions, and you'll see how they bear on the concern we have with individualism, with the stress on abstract choice. But the third feature that comes out here is that the religious perspective takes time seriously. We learn as human beings, quite simply. We learn. We build up a sense of who we are and what we are capable of through narrative. We look at what has made us what or who we are, what has brought us where we are. We reflect on that, and we regard it as constitutive of the identity that we hold. A cultural worldview which takes us out of time, which says at any given moment you can be whatever you want to be, you can do whatever you want to do, cuts us off from that sense that we are always learning. Now, that third point about time, of course, relates to how we understand tradition. And this is where, in our discussions, we found ourselves frequently struggling. Both Christians and Muslims in the discussion were profoundly conscious of what I think we can best call a sense of indebtedness. We have learned from those who have walked the way of faith before us. But does that learning mean that there is never any innovation? And does it mean that there is never any criticism of what has gone before? Does tradition, the process of handing on wisdom across the centuries, does it build up steadily, uncovering more and more truth, more and more possibilities in a straight line? Does it simply repeat or reproduce initial encounters with God? Or does it sometimes need to be challenged, its direction shifted, its presuppositions questioned? How far this is something we can explore in detail now, I don't know. But I think there was a sense in some of our discussions, at least, that Christians and Muslims did not always approach tradition or history in the same way. And yet these questions about how you legitimately challenge what has been handed on, how you question what's received, all of those were very clearly around in the discussion. Nobody was very keen on supposing that tradition was always simply about repetition. Faithfully doing the same thing across the centuries turns out to be a lot more complicated than it sounds. Because, as has sometimes been said, as was said by Cardinal Newman among others, to do the same thing now as you were doing 100 years ago means doing something different from what people were actually doing 100 years ago. How do we make sense of that? Continuity and change. Well, those are some of the areas that we've been talking about in the last 2 days. As usual, when academics get together, definitions which seemed straightforward at first have been thoroughly confused in the discussion, put into the melting pot, stirred around, and are still washing in a kind of dissolved state as we speak. But that's why we have these discussions, to stop ourselves taking concepts so much for granted that we become unintelligent in our use of them. So both our great words, tradition and modernity, have been probed, tested, approached from very diverse perspectives. But perhaps the most fundamental thing which has come through, the most fundamental opposition between religious traditions as we've been discussing them and the evaluative modern worldview, has been something to do with a sense of giftedness. We found ourselves as people living within religious traditions, wanting to say our primary relationship to what we receive is gratitude for the opening up of possibilities. And our concern about the modern worldview was how little room it seemed to give for that fundamentally grateful appropriation of reality, truth, as it came to us. Is the modern worldview, and with all the qualifications we've entered on that, is it somehow hostile to or suspicious of the very idea of gift and gratitude? And is that one of the things that makes religious belief and practice difficult in our age? And sometimes it seems inaccessible to some of our contemporaries. One last point before I ask my colleagues here to join in. One last point, I think, is that we were also aware of the way in which living in the context of an individualistic, freedom-oriented, choice-oriented cultural climate, how that inevitably put to us questions as religious believers that weren't there before and which we couldn't ignore. So the agenda that some people would define as emancipation, very characteristic of modernity, that does mean that religious traditions have to confront issues that they have not systematically looked at previously. Gender questions are just one of the more obvious cases in point there. We can't ignore them. We can't simply repeat what was there before, because the climate in which we stand has changed, and what we communicate is therefore going to sound different. So there is a political dimension to this as well. And one of the most difficult and most unresolved areas of our discussion also had to do with how some of these considerations carry across into politics in the widest possible sense. There are those defenders of tradition who would say very firmly there's something fundamentally wrong about modern democracy, But once modern democracy has raised its question, how do you involve the free consent of the mass of a population in the business of life together? Once you've raised that question, it's not enough just to say it's the wrong question. And that's part of the struggle that we're involved in as people of faith, looking at the modern worldview. So, just a few of the things we've been talking about. I hope some of them may ring enough bells for you in the audience to want to pursue further discussion. There are, of course, many people among you who've taken part in the private discussions of our seminar. I hope they'll contribute too, though, as was said on Tuesday, the old family hold back principle is quite a good one here. Those who haven't taken part in our discussions should have a chance to raise their questions. But I'm now going to ask other members of the panel to share very briefly some thoughts on how it's been for them. Dr. Sarouche.
Shall I begin? Thank you very much, dear Archbishop, and thanks all of you, and good afternoon to all of you. Well, I have to be very brief, 3 minutes to 4, and the question which I have to, all of us have to respond to is what was our impression, or perhaps first impression of this seminar. Well, I have got some very modest points to make here. First of all, of course, the subject of the seminar was not that impressive, in the sense that I have been to many seminars discussing the issue of modernity and tradition in Iran and outside Iran. But something was different here, although the subject was quite usual. And that was the way that we went about it, to discuss it. Archbishop mentioned that freedom is, the meaning of freedom is nobody tells me what to do. And I would like to tell you that we did not have any freedom in this seminar. Every moment they told us what to do, where to go, what to read, how to discuss, and going from one place to another, and this and that. So in that sense, but it was a very auspicious, bondage, a very auspicious having no freedoms, because we used our time in the best possible way. And really, this was the first good impression that I got. We spent 2 days, all of us, and we spent every minute of it in a very productive way. And I think all of my colleagues would share the same idea. It was very serious, especially that they did not give any of us any honoraria. And that means that it was even very serious. And the people, took part not for anything which is marginal to the real subject of the seminar, but for the sake of the seminar, for the sake of the discussion, and for the sake of being illuminated and illuminating others, and to take part quite severely and seriously in the discussions, learning, giving and taking, and all that, which I really appreciate, and I really, and from the depth of my heart, extend my gratitude to the Archbishop and to the organizers of the seminar, which was so educating. And the third is the presence of the Archbishop himself and his guardianship over the whole seminar. That was really a gift, and I really appreciate that. And it was a very real thing to me, because this was the first time in my whole life, despite my taking part in many seminars like this inside my country, Iran, outside country, in Europe, in America. I have never been to such a conference with such a person, such a high-ranking person, having so much responsibilities, but taking his time to stay with us and to, behave like a member of, like any of us, take part, in earnest in all discussions. And I remember, I don't want to tell you the story of some other seminars, religious and non-religious, that I took part in Iran, outside Iran, and the events that happened because of the participation of some high-ranking clerics. But fortunately and auspiciously here in this seminar, actually we had the presence of the Archbishop. It was a blessing, and I hope that his modesty and his participation extends to other seminars like this in future. I tell you one story. I was in Greece once, and we had interfaith discussions. And I quite remember that one of the participants came up and said, okay, we have got here the discussion between the Orthodox Christianity and Muslims, but there is no place for Catholic or Protestant heretics here. So that was the condition from the beginning of the seminar. And there are so many other stories like this. So do not be surprised that I am so impressed with such a friendly atmosphere, encountering here and benefiting from, and taking, some good gifts with me from this. Thank you again. Thanks you all.
Thank you for those generous remarks. We, of course, welcome heretics of all kinds to this seminar. Harriet.
My first impression really is how good it is to meet together, how good it is to eat together, how good it is to talk together, and how those goods also highlight that we don't and perhaps can't worship together. And although we can't worship together, I felt that there was very much an honouring of the spiritual depth at present, if you like, and that was given expression at the end of our small group session when the chair asked if we would just keep a moment's silence, that sort of gathered everything together. And I felt that, although in a sense nobody quite said so, that it was deeply appreciated. Another impression I've had is how we managed to discuss a provocative feminist text without any fireworks at all and without any perceptible sense of threat. And I wondered then what streams we've been wading through, what streams of tradition, what streams of modernity we've been wading through that has enabled us to do that. Because had we been thrown back to 1981, I think it was 1981 when Fiorenza's book came out, I think there would have been fireworks. I think there would have been discomfort. And so I suppose what I want to say is that I don't want to be ungrateful for the things that modernities have given us, which also I think belatedly today we did acknowledge the goods, and I felt connected to that. I don't want to be ungrateful. I'm not at all. I'm very grateful for my liberal upbringing, my liberal workplace, and the liberal parts of the church of which I'm a member, which enable people to stay in the church when other bits of it have been felt uncomfortable or felt compromising. So I suppose wrapping that bit of my reflection up, it's about gratitude, and some of that gratitude is towards modern liberal positions. And a further impression I've had really has been about the content of our discussion, the consensus about, although modernities, they're diverse, but the consensus about modernity somehow being a loss of the sense of transcendence and a feeling that human beings are self-sufficient. And that, to me, is a really important impression, because it leads me to ask whether the problems of modernity, insofar as they're problems, aren't actually just the problems of humanity. That all through the history of humanity, we have tried to be self-sufficient and have forgotten that our reference lies outside ourselves. And it just leads me to ask whether, whether our ways of responding to modernities need be any different from how we respond to the basic problem of human pride.
Thank you very much indeed. John.
I guess I'd start out by saying these days, recently, the last couple of years, whenever I've heard the name of a scholar or some point of view or some person who is interesting, of course the natural reaction is to want to go and read something that they've written. But now in the age of YouTube and iTunes, I always want to take a look and see the person themselves. And the reason I do that is because I think there's a lot to be gained by watching somebody think about things, and especially question and answer sessions that you can find sometimes online, and if you're not able to attend yourself. There's a lot of the perspective that person embodies that's conveyed in a whole piece to me that happens in that way that I think that you can't get sometimes by reading even all of what they've written. And it gives you, and to me, one aspect of learning and education is to sort of understand and really understand where it is that a person is standing and sort of how they survey the terrain and how they situate themselves. And that's not easy to get just from their writings. And so one of the very enriching parts of the way that this seminar has been constructed is that, I mean, not only is there a sort of formal presentation that's given, then we have the more informal discussions, and then there are the great in-between breaks. I mean, to me, it was the breaks that was the real highlight of the, you're standing there sipping coffee, and suddenly somebody opens up about some subject, and you're just, wow, your mind is blown, and then you just go on to the next thing. And so, if only for the coffee and muffins, I mean, I would have come. And and those kinds of things I find stick. And so, I mean, no matter how many books I read or articles that I read, the actual encounter with the person and the interaction and watching them think through something, that stays with you. It's very hard to forget those kinds of things. The information that they convey comes in a context, and that's very, very valuable, and I wish I could get more of it. And the way that the conference has been structured is almost ideal for that, because it gives time for people to get comfortable, to sort of talk things out, give room to breathe. The old, I think it's a Cherokee text which really exalts the virtues of people just sitting quietly during a conversation in silence, giving the other person plenty of time to respond, not this rushed thing which often makes you think badly and then not much information comes across. And so, I mean, I second all of the things that Dr. Sarouche said and that Harriet said, and that I warmly thank the Archbishop for having me, and I think it's a great model for other conferences, and I just hope this kind of thing can continue.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Gavin.
Well, I suppose sort of just reflecting on the term building bridges, because I know when I came here, I had this sense actually that because this has been going on for some time, I was not involved with that rather difficult work of getting the bricks and laying them, that there were actually bridges that had been set in place. And the thrill now was being invited to walk over riskily to the other side and then walk back and sometimes get a nice sense of dizzy disorientation about where one might be. But I think the other thing about the metaphor of building bridges, and it's kind of moved on, was this wonderful incident that happened, which if I can, I've asked Mohammed if I can share this, so this is not breaking any sort of confidence or whatever. In the mornings, there's been a certain pain in my heart, but also a certain joy that we've had a Mass and then an Anglican Eucharist and then a Mass. And there's that sense in which we can both come together, and there's a point at which there's that memory that we are not yet united. On the day that Rowan was taking the Anglican service, Muhammad Khalil came to the foyer when we were all waiting to be led through Georgetown to get to the chapel, and said, "Can I come to your Anglican service?" As a Roman Catholic, I felt a bit uncomfortable saying, "Oh yes," but I said, "Yes, of course, of course." And there was this moment of remarkable initiative, that sense of actually what was happening here was someone was interested very reverently to see what mattered most, what counted most. And it was a curious experience, because when we got to the chapel, talk about tradition, modernity, these issues, there was a a quaint chap with a beard dressed in very, very strange robes that you don't see anywhere except Druid festivals. And the Archbishop was actually taking the service. So there was that sense of connecting up with a liturgy and a set of practices that go back a long time. And the particular day that was being celebrated was the feast of St. Augustine of Canterbury. So it also had this wonderful sense of the presence of the pre-modern. And here was a situation which seemed a wonderful gift of our time. Here was someone who said, "Can I come? Watch, be present." And I think that's for me the big thing I take away from this conference. It's the being present with others as they inhabit their traditions in very complicated ways, and being present in a way that there wasn't a problem about asking difficult questions. And that for me was special. So I happened to be in the same group as Dr. Sarouche. And after the first session, when things started easing out, it was just wonderful. I was able to ask him all the questions I had wanted to, and I didn't have to feel uncomfortable, and I could push him hard and say, "But aren't you assimilating to modernity too much at this point?" And here was the person actually telling me, talking to me about their own perception of it. So I want to reiterate, bridges have been built, and I think materially, I should say, because it's important to remember these bridges have been deeply dependent on the material and generous assistance of Georgetown. And spiritually, and I think I echo what the other speakers have said, creating space for different folks to be together, and creating that space to be together to deal with difficult issues, that's the very special gift of Rowan's chairing. That sense of constantly opening up spaces. So if I could just end with two things, because I thought, what have I learned as a Catholic from coming to this conference about my own tradition? And what have I learned about Islam? And lots and lots, but this is just the 1-minute soundbite, and I'll finish then. What I learned about Catholicism for myself, and this is my own kind of issue, is that the notion of modernity is so complex that the rejection of elements of modernity had great wisdom within them, within a Catholic struggle. But there was also moments when huge amounts of wisdom, insight, may have been missed in that process. So I think in these last 3 days, I've revisited some questions I'm grappling with as a Catholic theologian about the nature of modernity. And that's been immensely helpful. What I've learned about Islam in this connection was that the notion of an Islamic modernity, which is not necessarily the same at all as the type of modernity that was being undergone by Catholic Christianity. And the differences relate to such profound issues as the whole issue of colonialism, the issue of nationalism, the fact that some of our writers from the Muslim tradition are speaking when suddenly European colonialism has allegedly left these lands and there's a power vacuum, and the whole situation of thinking about these questions is so different. So I think the thing I've learned about Islam is I can learn a lot more from it if I know more about it. Not to draw too many easy analogies, but the analogies which I have been able to draw have helped me hugely to recognize we grapple with the same sorts of difficulties at times, but for the reason of searching after blessings and that theme of the gift, which is certainly going on in this question of tradition and modernity.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you for those contributions. And I wonder if I could come back, Harriet, to your challenge and ask some of the others on the panel what they thought about it. Is modernity a new kind of problem, or is it just old-fashioned human difficulty by another name? Is there something distinctively new and hard about the modern situation? What did people think in response to that? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, well, certainly there are something quite new in modernity, which the people who lived in the traditional world did not encounter. Actually, we discussed part of it this morning and throughout the whole seminar. And everybody, of course, had some notion of modernity and tradition. When he came to this seminar, we polished the notions and we discussed in order to make it, clearer. For me, modernity has got, to be very brief and very simple, has got two elements, a hardware element and a software element. The hardware element is electricity. Now, if there were not electricity, we would not be here, and the light that we have got here would not be here. The planes that flown us here did not fly us, and many other things which need not any explanations. And honestly, I think that the electricity is the mother of the hardware modernity. So that is the first. Now, coming to the software modernity, it is the mother of technology and everything. I need not go into that, extensively. Now, as to the software element, or the element, or the constituent of the software modernity, I think, and I can defend it, it's the notion of rights. I think the notion of rights can explain virtually everything that we find new in modernity, apart from the hardware modernity, which is technology and science and all that. But the idea of rights, the notion of rights, to me is very important. It entails the idea of liberty, individualism, and our modern view of religion, our modern relationship with God, and all that, our modern ethics, modern law, everything, I think, and I can discuss it, is based on the idea of rights. Let me just put it more clearly. I think in the traditional world, people lived in a paradigm of duties and obligations. Law and Islamic Sharia was based on the idea of duties. God and man had the relationship of a master and a slave, that he actually delivers obligations and duties to them. And man had the vision of a duty-bound creature vis-a-vis God, that he is there in order to perform and to fulfill his duties and obligations, lest he should be punished by God, or perhaps he would be rewarded by God if he performs his duties and so on. Ethics was the ethics of duties. The relationship between a king and his subjects also was a duty and obligation relationship. There was no notion of citizenship as we have it in the modern world. So the politics was a duty politics, was not a rights politics, and so on and so forth. I can go on and explain to you that even economics and many other things, they are all revolve around the pivot of rights in the modern world. Therefore, we are really living a new paradigm, a virtually different paradigm. No, this does not mean that in the world of tradition we did not have the notion of rights. Yes, we did have, and you can find it everywhere, but it was not the dominant notion. The dominant one was duty and obligation. And now we have got the notion of duties. Of course we have it, but again, it is not dominant. And the dominant discourse is a discourse of rights. You know that we have got the Declaration of Human Rights because we live in the paradigm of rights. We do not have a Declaration of Human Duties. I mean, recently there was, maybe the Archbishop knows about it, a group of scholars and politicians came together in order to draft a Declaration of Human Duties, and they drafted it, and I was part of it. And they sent it virtually to all European parliaments, European powers. And according to the report that I received last year, none of the European parliaments accepted it. And they said that this is the foundation of a new totalitarianism, a new dictatorship. This is very important. We are living in an age of rights. We are no longer living in an age of duties. Now, I would like to tell you that our understanding of religion in the modern world is a religion based on our choice and our rights. Whereas in the past, in Christianity, in Islam, religiosity, religiousness, faith was based on the notion of obligation. It was your duty to worship God. It was your duty to be religious. It was your duty to go to church and this and that. But now it is your right to worship the God. It is your right to be religious. And because of that, there will be no law of apostasy anymore. Because if you are not a faithful person, if you are not a religious person, still you are a human being, and you have got every right to live, and so on and so forth. So for me, I think we are living in an age of rights, in an age of electricity. And both of this, electricity gives us the power that our forefathers did never enjoy such a power, you know, to control the nature and to use the power. And we are living in an age of rights which virtually has dominated and influenced all what we had in the world of human beings in terms of ethics, law, politics, religion, and everything. So yes, this is my final verdict, if you like.
Kevin.
I mean, I think I would agree with Harriet that in one sense that in terms of a kind of symbol system which has practices associated with it and political discipline, yes, modernity is one more, if you like, historical moment where a new form of discourse is met by a Christian set of practices and traditions. So in one sense there is something like, yes, it is part of the human condition, but I think there are 3 or 4 features which make it absolutely distinctive and quite different, and this connects with some of the elements that Professor Sarouche has spoken about. I mean, I think the first is that apart from certain Greek philosophical movements that never had political power, modernity is a profoundly desacralizing process in so much as it is related to instrumental technology. So let's be very careful to be qualified, because there are lots of different forms of modernity. The particular type which I think is unique and poses really searching questions is a form that, through a type of ideological atheism that has been associated with it, sees the nation state as the place where values and traditions should be controlled. So that we get the emergence of different forms of European and American modernity with lots of different nuances and complexities. But one issue which therefore then poses a dramatic challenge is that a type of what I'd called ideological modernity claims that it has the rights to shape public discourse, and that public discourse needs to be controlled and conformed to the rules set by this type of mythos. And I think in that sense, there's a new challenge, and it's a remarkably interesting opportunity. because it prizes apart a kind of connection, at least within Christian history, between the state and religion. It provides, in one sense, possibly quite a lot of opportunities. It provides for an established church different types of questions, I think. But the question then is, here is, when it's presented in this fashion, a competing worldview that actually has social and structural power. And this sets up some of the tensions, I think, that we see within both of our traditions of the Christian and the Muslim, dealing now with a presence that is trying to determine and shape what is the good. And it's when we get that type of conflict. And there's a very other interesting form of modernity, which I just, for lack of a better word, would call principled secularism as opposed to ideological. And this is actually a striving to create a forum where different groups can speak to each other in ways that can negotiate the common good, that can discuss what constitutes the common good. And I think for principled secularism, which is one child of modernity, that's an interesting discussion. And it's reached a certain point where some of its major proponents, Habermas, Rawls, have been pushed with the question, is this just a principled attempt to be neutral, or does it actually carry a baggage with it, which in effect constitutes what the public good is before this alleged conversation to come together to discuss what the public good is. So in that sense, I see modernity as a pretty differentiator. Those are just two of its heads, animal, which does pose a new challenge. And in that sense, there is both a continuity, because throughout Christian history, there has been different symbolic systems. And the exciting bit is how Christianity is that wonderful, rather imperialistic, but interesting metaphor, plunder the Egyptians. This great theme of take what wisdom you can find and use it. Not hopefully use in a destructive way, but a use that might, in some sense, enhance giving glory to God. So I mean, in that sense, I want to also state there's a positive relationship to modernity. What that positive relationship is, I think, is actually in the process of being articulated at this point of our history for Christianity.
I suppose I come at the whole question maybe a little bit differently, or just maybe want to add this perspective. To me, modernity is by definition, it's an epiphenomenon, which is to say that there's no reified thing called modernity. I mean, it's always necessarily the result of the sum total of human activity. But it's quite literally, it can be broken down into its constituent parts. I mean, there's not a magical being or spirit or something like that called modernity. And I might even say then that tradition, on the other hand, is not merely an epiphenomenon, in that there is something whole about it, there is something real, but I would set that aside for a second. I'm coming back to the idea of what makes modernity modernity, and how do you get modernity. And I tend to view it not so much in terms of ideas such as rights or obligations or some of these concepts which to me are extremely slippery, and there's a lot of give and openness to manipulation when it comes to these ideas, because they're secondary ideas. They're not, like for example, a right is not something that can be found as a quality of a human being or as a quality of something. I mean, it is very much an abstraction. So the question is, well, what is it an abstraction from? What is an obligation an abstraction from? And one way I think of looking at modernity is to look at it as an accumulation of choices, an accumulation of decisions, an accumulation through history of certain human qualities manifesting rather than other human qualities, an accumulation of certain ways human beings look at things instead of another accumulation of ways human beings look at things. And I think, for example, just bringing it back to a traditional, old-fashioned way of looking at the virtues and the vices. you know, the 7 deadly sins and so forth and so on. I mean, I think it's possible to as in a sense, as a kind of hermeneutical tool, to look at a phenomenon like modernity in terms of human qualities, which is to say, what sum total of human qualities and human predispositions and attitudes can you combine together in order to get the kind of society that we live in, that we call modern? And what kind of sum total of attitudes, spiritual attitudes and dispositions, and what you call the virtues, that is to say, human qualities, courage, wisdom, temperance, all those sorts of things that you could get that results in a traditional society. To me, that's getting at the idea of the real constituent parts of what we're talking about with these abstract principles. And I think it's a useful tool for getting at it. I mean, of course, talking about rights and obligations, this is useful. I mean, you don't just throw away all of your abstract concepts. They're extremely useful as tools to think with. But I mean, there is something there. There are real objects in the world that are bringing these effects about. What are the causes? What are the actual causes that lead to the actual effects? That's a way in which I try and think about it for myself, at least.
Harriet, any second thoughts before I throw it open to the audience?
I think just very briefly that I continue to think that whatever modernities are, the aspect of them that is problematic is that self-sufficiency aspect, which isn't itself unique to modernity.
They haven't invented a new sin.
No, hasn't invented a new sin. Yeah.
Well, let's take some questions from our guests in the audience. Who'd like to start? The microphone is there. And perhaps you'd introduce yourself as you come up.
I'm Ernest Tucker from the U.S. Naval Academy, and I want to thank everyone here for having an incredibly enlightened panel of thoughts and a wide range of things. One of the things that I find most upsetting on a daily basis about the conflict between modernity, if there is one, and traditionalism is the question of time. And I wonder, just want to sort of throw that out, and I know that you spoke a little bit about that in your remarks, the problem of time. And you know, it's a big topic, obviously, but just to muse thinking about that, and we have a little time, but oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe just a little bit more specificity on time, I'm sorry.
It's your choice, really.
All right.
Sorry.
You think of something.
Traditional versus modern time.
Oh, okay.
Things out of time, things in time, things on time, things electronic time are just time.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on the modern conception of time, and that was one of the big changes in terms of, if you look at the history of science, that time went from being a qualitative thing. Time could be different depending on where you were and what time of day it was. I mean, traditional astrology was based on that. I mean, that time is different, and you have to deal with the world depending on what time it is, and it's not. And what the modern, so the Newtonian picture of time was an absolute, unchanging, linear thing, which sort of brought us to heel. And then you had the kind of the proliferation of, clocks and clock towers and watches and so forth and so on. And so instead of time being a qualitative part of the world, it became a quantitative taskmaster. I mean, to really oversimplify it. And then you get the next stage in the scientific view of time, which was then to make it once again a question of relation, which is to say, depending on where you are and how you're moving, time is then intimately related to space. And that to me is one of the interesting things about the way that, I was talking about this a little earlier in the group. I mean, the modern conception of time has not yet really caught up that much with the scientific conception as it stands now. But it's really interesting that we went from qualitative time, that is some kind of relation, to an absolute unchanging linear time. And now we're back to something where time is again changing and flexible and so forth. And in terms of thinking about, well, let me stop there. I don't want to keep going.
Thank you very much. Harriet?
Yeah, I do think about the relationship between, or the contrast between time and timeliness. So where time has perhaps become so closely linked with efficiency, whereas timeliness is a matter of weighing and sensing and intuiting and gauging the right moment and doing things at the right time. And timeliness, I think, does have that transcendent reference, because it's about being in tune with something outside of oneself.
I think that the connection of time with efficiency, productivity, the measure of the value of time in terms of what can be made, what can be generated, that is something which has changed. Our apprehension of time certainly has taken us away from what some thinkers have spoken of as the sense of time itself as a gift. I think one of the things you could say was true in certainly traditional Christian discourse was time is given us. We pray for time to be given us, time for amendment of life in the Anglican liturgy, time for amendment of life in the grace and comfort of the Holy Spirit. Now that's a rather different kind of aura around the word time from time and motion and all those things, isn't it? Somebody else, sorry, Gavin, anyone else want to come to the microphone while Gavin...
Just a couple of thoughts on time, because it strikes me one of the interesting features in the question of time is the meaning of death. And one of the remarkable features of our modern, in terms of modern Western European societies, is the fear of death and the attempt to insure against it, sue against it, protect oneself in whatever manner, because fundamentally underlying a linear view of time is that when it's finished, if you haven't achieved, that's it. Now this is kind of an interesting contrast, I think, to an eschatological view of time, where time isn't going to be looked at in a straightforward linear fashion, but in the fashion which actually sees time as a gift from the future to be able to enter into a relationship. I remember my child, when they were quite young, said, "Oh, isn't it a shame Jesus died so young? He missed out on so much of life." It was kind of an interesting question, actually. I mean, it struck me that, yes, he was, like my son was a child of his time. That sense of, well, if you only got to 33, well, you know, there's a lot more. And what's fascinating, I think, about a possible contrast between a type of linear time is that the learning how to die in Christian time is that we are dying at this moment. And death in that particular vision then is a very kind of different positioning in relationship to time. Just one thought.
I'm Father John Hoy, Woodstock Theological Center. I'm wondering whether that remark of Dr. DaCosta, was it about the experience of being in the presence of people who are celebrating their religious tradition, if I understood your remark correctly. I'm wondering whether there's ever been a different way of approaching dialogue. And Archbishop, I guess this would be a question to you. When John Paul got the various faith traditions together at Assisi, there was this dispute about whether everybody was coming together to pray or whether they were coming to pray together. And I'm wondering whether there's ever been an initiative taken that starts with the experience of worship in its variegated ways and then goes to dialogue.
Thank you. I think the answer is probably no at one level, partly because worship for each tradition is something embodied in practice, language, practices and words which carry commitments with them and which can't simply therefore be shared without question. Whether there's some way in which, without pretending to be what you're not, there's some route through shared spiritual activity that leads into dialogue? I think that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure of the answer. Others might have views.
Thinking about how ecumenical dialogue is very, very much formed by people of different churches worshipping together, and people's experience involved in it. And the extent to which churches can worship together depends on which churches are in the dialogue. So I mean, I think it is the case that if when the spiritual depths have been plumbed, if you like, that informs the discussion. I suppose perhaps the closest one gets to it is through practices like scriptural reasoning, yes, where you're reading scriptures together. Because again, that's deep speaking to deep, isn't it? Yeah.
And that has been, in a certain form, has been part of the experience of building bridges over the years, that while we haven't been able to have the experience of worship together in the ordinary sense, the reading of scriptural texts in each other's presence has been a significant element there.
I mean, there is a sense in worship. One has to understand whether one's talking about the cult, because in each of the traditions there is a series of cultic practices which are worship, which are very highly defining and part of what may be constituting as belonging to that tradition. But as Harriet mentioned, after one of our sessions, but interestingly I think it could have happened before one of our sessions, we might well have had a silence for a couple of minutes. Now, whether one calls that an act of worship, I guess if you were a Quaker, technically it becomes an act of worship, but the cult, when it comes to the Quakers, at least in the UK, is actually inviting anyone to take part in it. So, I mean, it's complicated, but I guess the one experience I've had of this event was when I went to visit my sister in Cairo when I was 18, and an American friend of hers was showing me around, and suddenly time for prayers came, and he said, "Quick, it's time for prayers," and grabbed hold of me, rushed me to the mosque, and before I could say, "Hang on, I have to think about this in conscience if it's comfortable," he was a very extravagant American. You know, he just sort of started washing, and I, to avoid embarrassment, followed it and went in and began to feel slightly sick in the middle of my stomach, thinking, oh no, I'm going to do something wrong. Everyone will know that I'm a fake. After a bit of time, it was the most wonderful experience of rhythmically joining in, because I felt, well, in good conscience, I'm doing this because I've been pushed into it. But I actually felt, gosh, I'm praying. I didn't know what the people were actually saying at the time. And then afterwards, we had a very interesting conversation, including my insistence that he should come to Mass with me on Sunday, since he had made me partake in his cultic worship.
John Borelli at Georgetown University. It seems that one of the fundamental features of modernity is something that's at the basis of what has been said so far about rights and about desacralization and so forth. And that is the philosophical turn to the subject. And it seemed that an impact on subjectivity and objectivity and theories of knowledge and self-knowledge. But as I listened to the 6 talks on Tuesday, it seemed that everyone was a modernist in the sense that they had accepted that and were grappling with that in their own tradition in varying degrees. Did you get into that in your discussions, how Muslims and how Christians have been dealing with that, the implications? For example, choice comes out of that too, the role of choice, as you were mentioning, Archbishop, I guess. Do Christians and Muslims grapple with that differently? And what have you learned from one another in dialogue as you were talking about that? Were you able really to communicate the kinds of problems that you were having or developing or considering, or the questions you were raising? Was there real communication or miscommunication taking place on that question?
I think I'd encourage Abra Karim to comment on that.
Well, of course, subjectivity, according to modern philosophers, is one of the main features of modernity, and this is very prominent in Heidegger and his followers, and in Nietzsche, of course, and starting from Descartes, of course, subject and the reflexivity on the subject is the main idea of the modern philosophy until over time that this itself now is a questionable concept. We did not discuss this in our discussions, so far as I know, and in our discussion group, this was not raised up, and nobody, because we did not discuss modernity from the point of view of philosophy, of the new developments in philosophy, and never tried perhaps to define modernity or its essential constituents. So there were suggestions, and I think subjectivity, of course, was something that should have been taken seriously and should have been discussed. But for some reasons, as I said, at least in our discussion groups, it never came up. All we did was the relationship between tradition and modernity, especially the religious tradition and modernity, which, of course, was the main subject of the conference, of the seminar. What I got from our discussions, discussions went on very nicely, and we said nice things to each other. Perhaps we did not challenge each other so seriously, which it so happens usually in seminars and in discussion groups. But nevertheless, some serious challenges actually we took and we discussed. What I noticed was that I don't know, our friend Gavin, he thinks that perhaps the orientation of the Christians towards modernity was very different from Muslims, whereas my understanding and my impression was quite different. I thought, and I was under the impression that, for example, in Newman, in the Elizabeth of Firenze and others, especially when it came to the text, for example, the Quran or the Bible, and the problems that it poses when you look at it from a modern point of view, and the solutions offered in order to solve those problems, I found virtually the same. And this tells me the unity of human experience. Of course, in theology, we are different. The theology of Christianity is very different from that of Islam, and so on. But as a whole, as a religion, as a body of which is constituted of the idea of holiness, when it comes to modernity and the relationship between modernity and religion, I think the responses are virtually the same. It's very important. I had a different, experience within the Islam. I was editing a book written by a Shiite, a scholar in 16th, 17th century AD. The book is an edition of Al-Ghazali's book, which was written in 11th century. Now look, nobody can be considered as further from Shiism as Al-Ghazali. He didn't like Shiism. He was a very prominent scholar, Sunni scholar. Now, 6 centuries after his death, a Shiite scholar, took himself the task to re-edit and to rewrite Al-Ghazali's book from a Shiite point of view, and he did it. and the book is with us now. It's a unique experience in the whole world of Islam, throughout the culture of Islam. It is second to none, actually. So it was the unique experience. Now, a Shiite in the time of the Safavids, he did it. It's quite a big book, a hefty one, in 8 volumes. Now, I read, the whole book through, and I wrote, extensively about it. What struck me was this, that despite the theological differences between Shiism and Sunnism, when it comes to the issue of morality and mysticism, both actually think the same. All problems virtually are solved. 75% of the book of Al-Ghazali has remained just untouched. The rest 25, which deals with Sharia, the precepts of Sharia, and deals with theology, has been changed by the second author. Now, when it comes to different religions, I have got virtually the same, experience. When it comes to mysticism, Christian mysticism, when it comes to morality and ethics, there is not much difference between Islam and Christianity. But when it comes in theology, to theology, God, and especially the definitions, and there we have got the differences. So this, again, I learned in these discussions, that how much close we are to each other from the point of view of mysticism, spirituality, morality, and so on. But when it comes to theology per se, about the theological definition of God, or perhaps some of the practices in the church, some of the shapes and forms of worshiping, there actually the differences, appear and emerges. Therefore, I think in such dialogues, I think that a common worship is a very good thing, and that would be the pinnacle of the dialogue, if we can perform it. And if we can, go about it in order to make it possible. Of course, if I take part in a church in a Eucharist, I won't drink wine, but that is not the essential part of it, of course. It's by accident. So, but nevertheless, the rest is okay. The spirituality which is there, the remembrance of God, the relationship between us, my feeling as a servant to God, as somebody who is under His grace, who is asking His grace and His blessing and so on, everything, these are quite, similar to each other, which makes us, speak the same language, which makes us, close to each other, not only as human beings, but as servants of God.
Could I just quickly follow up on that?
Very briefly, I'd like to get the 2 questioners in before we close.
Just very quickly, I think that the turn towards the subject is not so much that, the Cartesian turn is decisive in terms of tradition and modernity, not so much because it's a turn towards the subject. Because after all, if you look at Advaita Vedanta, it's all subject, it's all the self. And that's definitely not a modern system of thought. There's the difference between the self with the small s and the self, capital S being. And so that one doesn't get into those problems. The problem with the Cartesian move is, of course, the move towards dualism, which is to say the thinking subject and then the material object. And that's really, I think, where that's where, I think, therefore I am. That's what becomes, in a sense, it changes everything after that. It's the dualistic aspect of it, not so much the fact that it has to do with the subject, which permeates all traditional cultures in one way or another.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the 2 questioners to come one after the other, and then do a roundup of comments from the panel.
Just a brief comment on the concept that we cannot, as Christians and Muslims, pray together. I think we can, and I think we do it more often than we think we do. For example, if you go to condole someone, I have lived for several years in a Muslim environment in Egypt and in Sudan. You go to condole someone when someone has died in their family. You walk in the house and you stand for a moment. And what are you doing? You are praying. You're asking God's blessing on this family and on the person who's died. But the most wonderful experience I had of this was one time when I was working in Sudan with a group of Christian and Muslim women, and we came together we were talking about our differences which unite us, which became our sort of theme. And we were all just so disempowered by the fact that there had been this terrible fighting breaking out again in southern Sudan, and we didn't know what to do. And we just sat there in silence. And finally, I found myself saying, "Shall we pray?" And we all stood up, and we prayed silently together for peace. And I think that was one of the most moving experiences of my life, and that's available to us.
Thank you very much. And next.
Thank you very much. Ayman Shabana, University of Tennessee, School of Foreign Service, Qatar. Following up with the question on subjectivity, I was interested in the question of postmodernity and whether you got a chance to discuss that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to, whoops, dropped something. I'm going to ask all members of the panel for some brief reactions to that and any concluding remarks, but I would invite them to be economical with their observations, as I'm sure some people will need to get back and have their dinner. And I'll start with Gavin.
Postmodernity came up in some of the discussion of McIntyre and the relationship of modernity to postmodernity. And I think there's a sort of interesting question, because at one level, from McIntyre's point of view, this is, if you like, the parasitic child of modernity, and the only use of it, critically speaking, is that it allows modernity's pretension to be some sort of absolute standpoint to be disclosed. But that was the main context. So my one other last remark is that I'm not entirely sure I would agree with the earlier discussion about the way in which both of the traditions relate to modernity in the same way, only for this reason. If one genealogically looks at European modernity and analyzes it as coming out of a certain kind of Christian moment in history, there's a different sort of relationship then when Christianity meets up with modernity, because essentially it's part of its own tradition gone down what might be called a sort of certain nominalist path, which creates, I think, quite different sorts of questions because of the internal constitution of modernity. But okay.
I would just make a comment about the idea of common worship. I think the idea of common worship would always, if I think Muslims and Christians are going to be faithful to their respective traditions, would have to be undertaken with an awareness, as for example from the Muslim side, that the form of certain modes of worship and ritual are determined by God, which is to say they're not conventional, they're not things that we came up with. And in a certain sense that as a Muslim I don't have a right to participate in a ritual that God, let's say, decided for another religion and vice versa. There are modes of, I think, being present and sort of maybe appreciating certain modes of worship. And of course, when it comes to just common prayer, that can always be done together. What would make me nervous is the idea of, let's say, a Muslim participating in the Eucharist, or a Christian participating in Salat, or something like that. That's where I think members of both religions get understandably nervous, and where I think the pitfalls outweigh the potential benefits.
Harriet.
I suppose that can be managed by when you worship, you don't break the rules of the worshipping tradition of the people you're worshipping with. I mean, you have rules of inclusion within any religion. I think coming back to the question of choice, we did talk about choice, really interesting. And Lucy Gardner made the point that in modernity we have the sense we can choose our religion, but we grow into a sense that we are also chosen by it, and that God calls us into the paths that we're in. And I think I'm in the frame of mind that there's nothing new under the sun, because it seems to me that it's a very good example of the paradox with which both our traditions wrestle, that on the one hand we have free will, and on the other hand God ordains everything. But it does help. I think I found it helps and perhaps opens the way to worshipping together, that we can recognise that each of us is called into the traditions which we inhabit.
Thank you.
what should I say? I spoke a lot, and well, I mean, I just want to remind you, about the worship. That according to Islamic Sharia, all worships of Islam is obligatory for Christians as well. They have to pray, they have to fast, So let us not, overlook that. So there is such a fact in Islamic fiqh, in Islamic law. They have to, but it will not be accepted from them. So, I mean, both sides of it, unless they become Muslims. So there is such a paradox there, and this is, in the Islamic Sharia. But I think the common prayer is a very good idea, actually. I mean, apart from some differences, the Prophet, let Christians go into the mosque and pray for themselves. Of course, he didn't pray with them, but he did, and he thought that perhaps even the mosque is the place for the Christian, prayer proper. And that Rumi, one of the greatest mystics, he would, stay nights with Christian monks, and it was not just for, entertainment, they worshiped together. So we have the precedent of that, and we can create it, anew in over time. I'm sure that it creates some embarrassment, at the outset, but we can, having dialogues. If you speak about having dialogue with Jews or with Christians, with some of the, religious authorities, they abhor, they do not like it. But fortunately nowadays the dialogue is going on, and it has become, a usual practice, and everybody enjoys it. And now, even the religious authorities in our countries have come to realize that there are so many benefits in it. Now, as to the worship, the time may come that that might become a practice which is endorsed by all parties. But anyway, as far as this, the postmodernity is concerned, as I remember, what we discussed this morning was following the question of one of the participants that can modernity become a tradition in its own turn? One of the answers was that no, modernity cannot become another tradition, because tradition was not self-reflexive, whereas modernity is self-reflexive, and postmodernity also is therefore postmodernity is a higher order modernity. It doesn't mean that it is a modernity with respect to another tradition. So I think postmodernity is a very blessed happening in our time, and it has disclosed, as Gavin mentioned, the arrogance of modernity. And it has shown us that the plurality and diversity is such an important thing, and there are reasons rather than there are one single reason. And I like, partly the definition of Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, who said in the traditional time, God was God, and then in modernity, reason is God, and in postmodernity, there will be no God at all. So that may not be, to our taste as religious persons, but at least it is a good thing, because reason is no longer a God. And or if it is a God, then it is not a single God. There are many other gods around. And therefore, the diversity, is there. And I think it is very important. The very possibility of having dialogue nowadays, I think, is because of modernity and postmodernity. And the diversity now is being recognized as one of the gifts of God, as one of the blessings of God, rather than of curse of God. And nobody now is thinking to reduce diversity into unity. That is not a good idea anymore, neither possible nor desirable.
Thank you very much. I sense that there's some unfinished business here around shared worship and prayer, which could take us another few weeks to tease out further. And also what's been said about postmodernity and the arrogance of modernity is not a bad point at which to leave the discussion. I suspect one of the things that we've found ourselves all wanting to say and sharing in the last couple of days is a resistance to what some people would see as the characteristic modern approach, which says this is the position of the reasonable person. No reasonable person could disagree with this. We will tolerate you if you disagree, but basically everybody is reasonable in this way, this modern way. Postmodernity has, at the intellectual level, dealt a bit of a blow to that, overdue. But in order to make that something other than simply a negative and nihilistic move, I think we do have to come back to the question of what is the self as constituted, the subject as constituted by the sacred, constituted by relation to God, not just a free-floating empty signifier. And I think that's where the conversation, the dialogue continues. And I hope that in this discussion you've picked up some flavour of what we've been talking about in the last couple of days and why we've enjoyed ourselves so much. So I'd like to thank members of the panel. Thank you all for being here and for your support of this seminar at Georgetown.